Good afternoon, class. Today I'm going to be teaching you about the 5 types of building construction. It's important to know the 5 types of building construction because it'll teach you how the fire is going to behave according to the material that is burning. It'll teach you how long you have to be inside the building before collapse. And it's also good for your own knowledge when you're pulling up to a fire to say this is how this fire could behave, this is how we need to fight the fire. And it's just good for all-around knowledge and safety. Next slide, please. Type 1, fire resistant. It's the first type. It's made up of non-combustible materials and has a specific fire rating or resistance. A good example is steel. Protected steel with a spray-on coating, or they have paint-on coatings, will give the steel fire rating for how long before the steel can actually be affected by the fire, or the building structure will be affected. I have some pictures to show you. Next, please. This is an example of a Type 1 fire-resistant building. It's built out of fire-rated materials, and every building has a fire rating on it telling you how long it'll last before the fire actually starts to affect the materials. Next slide, please. This is an example of protected steel. As you can see, it's sprayed on insulation almost to protect the steel from the fire, and it just keeps it from heating up, and that's what causes steel to weaken, is the heating and the expanding of the steel. Next slide, please. And there's another example of a Type 1 fire-resistant building. Most of your Type 1 fire-resistant buildings are usually warehouses, hotels, skyscrapers, big buildings like that. Type 2 non-combustible is your next type. The material that does not have a fire rating or resistance, such as unprotected steel. Your non-combustible buildings are going to be the same types of buildings, just without the protected steel or materials on it. Next slide, please. Your non-combustible construction can consist of walls, floors, and roofs that are made and supported by non-combustible material. Your trim in your interior, though, is obviously not a combustible material, so there's still stuff inside that can burn. So even though it says non-combustible or for the Type 1 fire resistant, it still has a flammability to it. Your non-combustible buildings are obviously not necessarily safer than frame or joisted masonry construction or other construction types. And that's because the building contents and trim and everything inside of it can burn, causing the steel to expand and heat, which can cause collapse or structure failure. Next slide, please. There's an example of a Type 2 non-combustible building. Obviously, like I said, it looks a lot like Type 1, just without the fire rating on it. So next, please. And there's your unprotected steel. It doesn't have the spray-on coating as a Type 1 does. Type 3 ordinary construction. These are going to be buildings that your exterior walls are made of masonry, so brick buildings. A good example is Old Colorado City. Most of the buildings there are made out of masonry or ordinary construction. You can tell an ordinary construction building normally by when there's a king's row every 4 rows or 5 rows in the bricks, and that's where instead of the bricks facing the long way, you have the short ends facing you, and that's to keep it, to make it stronger and keep it from crumbling and falling over. Next slide, please. Here's a good example, sorry it's a little blurry, of a Type 3 ordinary construction. It's hard to see, but it's a complete brick building. The insides are still made of wood and have wood flooring, wood members, and everything, but it's just the outsides that are made of brick. Next slide, please. Here's another example. It's obviously going to be a lot of your older buildings, downtown city areas. Next, please. One more example of it, older warehouses, things like that. Type 4 heavy timber is going to be beams, columns, floors, and roofs that are made of solid or laminated wood. Most of these buildings are going to be your old churches, old gymnasiums, barns, old warehouses, buildings back in the old days, and it's milled timber is what it is, so it's big chunks of wood that's a lot stronger, and this is going to have a longer fire resistance than your normal normal lightweight wood, and that's just because the bigger, thicker wood is going to take a lot longer to burn through. Next slide. Here's an example of it. As you can see, it's a lot thicker. It's got dimensions, corners on it. which gives it a lot better fire rating than most of your lightweight. Next, please. This is going to be one of your older style, old Type 5 or 4 buildings. Next, please. And there's an example of a barn or church or whatever it is, and that's made out of your heavy material. Type 5 is your wood frame. That's going to be your ordinary houses. Mostly new construction. The problem with lightweight framing is you don't have that long width before the collapse or structural failure with the fire. It's smaller wood, it's going to burn fast. They're kind of just slapped up and thrown up to build as quick as possible and get as many done as possible, and that's just, it's not necessarily the safest plan for when the fire affects it. Here's an example. It's a stick house practically, just made of really lightweight timber. It's strong, as long as it's not affected by flame. And that's the problem, is when the fire comes, it's not going to last very long. Next slide. Here's an example of their new construction coming up. A lot of townhouses, apartment buildings, and your normal houses are going to be made out of this now. And there's an example of like an apartment building being made out of lightweight timber. So now I'm going to show you guys slides of each building type, and I want you to kind of see which ones you think is made out of. So the first one, that's correct. It's a Type 5 lightweight timber construction. Like I said, most of your newer building houses, apartments are going to be made out of that. This is your, this is your Type 1. Fire resistant, and that's because it's got the spray-on coating over the steel to protect it from the fire and give it a fire rating. Type 3, ordinary construction, made out of brick. It's an old warehouse or storage or whatever it is. A lot of these, are going to be, they will have remodels in them sometimes, and there's your Type 3. Next, please. Fire, this is your non-combustible building, a lot of warehouses, parking garages, skyscrapers, a lot of the same buildings as your fire resistive, just without the fire rating and the spray-on coating. And heavy timber, as you can see, the big beams in there supporting it. And that's it. Thank you.